G'day, coming to you from the couch today. It's Gilbo or Gilbert Holmes, currently campaigning for the Federal Senate to represent Queensland. Today I'm talking about governance. So, as with other discussions, this one begins with a look at how we think. And so the modern era has been dominated by the idea, the cosmology of liberal individualism. Was Rene Descartes in the Enlightenment said that the separate individual is the starting point of philosophical inquiry, and subsequently across the range of political theory we have this individualism applied to politics, liberalism. So in the field of human rights, there's individual human rights as compared to collective rights. There is the identity defined by the individual. There is cosmopolitan ethics as compared to communitarian ethics. There is perhaps the most obvious example, there is capitalist free market competitive economics. The idea that separate individuals exist in a natural competition with one another, and if we enable that competition, then we'll all be better off. Classic liberalism. And there's the field of governance, where we've had discussion about liberal democracy. So with that liberal political theory, that whole collection of it, what we're going to say is actually it's incorrect. It's not to say that there hasn't been positives in the 500-year advance of liberalism. We've certainly seen advances in areas of human rights and human dignity, wealth generation, etc. There's been, in terms of how we've been represented in government, we've made significant strides. However, there's a fundamental error in the whole construction of liberalism, and that is that we're not just individuals, we're also a community. We're separate and we're connected. So we're both individuals in a natural competition with one another, but we're also motivated to commune with one another, resulting in this natural cooperation. And as with all of these binary concepts, they work together with balance. So we've had this described many, many times before. There's a few notable phrases that we can look to. There's yin and yang, Tao. Tao is the middle way, the balance between the extremes of yin and yang. We might be too strong, we might be too gentle in any circumstance, but then with balance we can be both very strong and very gentle. So we can swing between them. We might be aggressive, pathetic, and over time we become both strong and gentle with both positive. So it's been described as the golden mean by Aristotle. There was the dialogic process of Socrates which fed through to the Aristotle's description of this middle way, the middle way Buddha, of course, and subsequently these concepts have also fed in through the Quran, and wherein we find this concept described as the straight path, perhaps the central pillar of Islam is that we engage in the world in a way of moderation. So this widespread description of ethical outcomes in terms of balance and within a essentially polar cosmology has largely been forgotten in the modern era with the dominance of this liberal individualism. So we're revisiting that subject of governance today in the context of this polar cosmology. And we find we've got a lot to talk about. What we want to do is we look at principles of governance, and then we can look at building an ideal governance system, conceptually building an ideal governance system. Then we can look at specific policies, how those policies can be applied to, in this case, most specifically the Australian political situation, although many of these principles will be applicable more broadly. So in terms of the principles, looking for a middle way, a balance, where on the one hand we enable central governance capacity to administer the society as a whole, and on the other hand we want to enable local political autonomy, people looking after themselves at that small scale collectively. And the middle way between these extremes is for a tiered up, more directly democratic political system. It can be tiered from the small neighbourhood to the global scale. So, in terms of these principles, on the one hand we want the central government to be controlled from below, so it's strong central government but controlled from below so that it's not corruptible. And then we want local political autonomy down to those most local levels of society to be supported from above. At the neighbourhood scale, we can imagine that administrative capacity is less, so we have that more central capacity to support the more local political autonomy. We have the idea of subsidiarity, where the processes of the society are administered as locally as is reasonable. And we end up with a tiered up system. So I was talking about the economics of a diverse, interdependent community in another video about economics yesterday. And what we're looking at is again, liberalism has massive flaws here. We've been building under liberalism a society of heavily isolated individuals who are often found sitting in a car, driving somewhere else to go to work. There's zero in the way of neighbourhood governance, small suburb governance, effectively zero. There is very little in the way of social activity at these more local scales. People have friends online and friends elsewhere and often don't know their neighbours. So this failure of this misconception in the liberal tradition has led to these poor outcomes, where the competitive and cooperative balance that we might find in economics, ideally, is undermined, and we've lost out in terms of the governance as well, with vibrant, diverse local economies that are governed by people in their common interest through those smaller scales of society. All of that's been lacking from that liberal tradition. And this is the cornerstone of a more directly democratic governance system as well, because what we can do is tier up the governance. So if there's participatory self-governance at that neighbourhood scale, then there can be a representative, a directly controlled representative on the governance for the village. And the village can have a directly controlled representative in the town within the city-state. So this tiering up is essential for that principle of being able to control the central government from below, where we're enabling the governance, but we're controlling it from below. So, and that tiering within the political system is an essential component of that, and it needs to begin at the ground up. So these principles of of governance were tiered up, more directly democratic, subsidiarity. People are governed with governance occurring at as most local level as is reasonable depending on the particular issue. So a local government system can be expected to maintain some common assets for the people, run some common projects to enable the private industry to thrive within that local government area, to make local decisions. For example, that local information allows for on-the-ground decision-making that is missed out on when you're looking at a big bureaucracy. For example, with the Brisbane City Council, where I live, in terms of the housing, there's a shed that I know around here, very close to here, where it might be reasonable that a person could live, but there's just a bureaucratic rule. No one can live there. So if you have that local knowledge, on the ground local knowledge about decision making, you find you can short circuit in the human decision making rather than big bureaucratic decision making, which can lead to much better outcomes, for example, in terms of housing, but in other manners as well, in terms of the jumping through the legislative hoops. So I'm talking around this subject here. And so we're starting with a more local government to that neighbourhood scale, and we're tiering it up through villages, towns. So village is a small neighbourhood, a town is there's a small neighbourhood, maybe 20 to 100 people. There's a village or a small suburb, we're picking round figures, say 1,000 people. Then there's a town or a big suburb, 40,000 people. Then there's a city-state, million people. So that city-state scale is, we find, a natural major administrative centre. At those more local tiers of governance, we find that there's less administrative capacity. Sometimes the decision-making processes may be less formal, etc. So the city-state is then able to provide that administrative support for the more local tiers of government. And also with a diverse, vibrant local economy, we'll find that the city-state scale is the scale at which the society can be largely self-reliant. So it's still trading, but largely self-reliant. And in looking broader to the world scale, a cohesive global society is not one society, it's a mosaic of local societies. And that city-state scale, where people have some connection to place, local culture, local cultural identity, the city-state is a natural scale for a human civilization in that regard. So we'll talk about that in the Australian context, but I'm just painting the picture for you of this tiered up, more directly democratic, subsidiaristic governance system from the small neighbourhood to the global scale. Small neighbourhoods, villages, towns, city-state, nation, geo-region. So some nations existing already are beyond the geo-regional scale, but in the Australian context, we can look to a Indo-Pacific Union as a natural political union, a future Indo-Pacific Union like we can look to South America as a political union, African political unions, Middle East, Western Europe, etc. These geo-regional groupings provide an intermediary between the smaller nation and the world government. So with an Indo-Pacific political union, we can have, say, a new capital city in maybe West Papua, and we can build administrative capacity to support the welfare and of the people across the region of the Pacific, Indonesia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Papua, Australia, a political union, common laws, a future political union, and toward that future we can build again common identity as members of this political union, and beyond that scale, so the geo-regional scale, enabling us to deal with geo-regional political issues. Moving beyond that, we find the world government. As with governance at these other levels, world government, well-organised world government, is an intrinsic good. It's able to support us in many ways to live better lives. For example, in the management of our common interests, let's take the maintenance of a stable climate, for example. The current situation with climate change is a failure of governance, and we've found that the nations of the world have been unable to coordinate their activities sufficiently to be able to legislate, etc., in favour of maintaining a stable climate. Whereas a world government could help this. World government could help us maintain our common pool resources in the world fish stocks, the world's forestry, manage sustainably our other natural resources. We could embark on projects of medical research, other science, space travel more effectively if we're commonly governed. And world government also offers us a substantial opportunity in terms of enabling world peace. In this regard, if we have world government with the rule of law, world police, world courts, just like Queensland, then just like Queensland does not need a military to defend ourselves from New South Wales, because we have a common political union, the nations of the world will not need militaries if we have a common global political union. So building that global political capacity, we can set about dismantling the national militaries of the world. So again, with principles of tiered up, central government controlled from below, enabled central government, but control it from below, subsidiarised, subsidiaristic, so locally politically autonomous, supported from above. These are the key principles for a polar balanced governance. So comparing this again to the liberal tradition, we find in that liberal tradition a strong emphasis on the freedom of individuals, which is great, but conceptually it's much better to talk about the freedom of individuals as in a polar relationship with the cohesiveness of the society. Both of these things are positive, freedom and cohesion, and when they work together, they can both be maximised. But when we go too far in either direction, then if we go too far toward freedom, for example, not only is social cohesion undermined, but the expression of our individual freedom itself is actually undermined because there's anarchistic lack of law, etc. We find that individual freedom is maximised by that social cohesion and the vice versa. If we're too cohesive, then we'll be rebelling against that and we'll tear the society apart. So we need to enable both and for them both to work together. And with that discussion of the principles of governance from that liberal tradition, we've missed out a key element. And that is that people collectively work together to govern themselves in their common interest. So again, we're looking at that freedom of, now we're talking about the freedom of neighbourhoods and the freedom of villages, the freedom of city-states from the broader society. And so the freedom is not just about individuals, it's also about our communities. So it's essential that we understand the restructure, the conceptual nature with polarity and balance allows us to paint these principles of governance, and then with these principles we set about designing the specific ideals. We build a conception, we conceive of an idealized political system, then we can nail down specific policies and we can work toward these more locally specific, time-specific policies. So one more thing I want to say about this governance system, especially with local governance, is people need to build it for themselves. You can't impose it for them. You've got to enable and encourage people to build it through legislation and through, you can provide support, but if the people don't build it themselves, it's never going to work. So then we reached the point of having a bit of a look at the Australian situation again. We've talked a bit about Australia within geo-regional politics and with the Indo-Pacific Political Union. And we've talked these principles of decentralising governance and enabling local political autonomy and going hand in hand as well with diverse, vibrant local economies down through the neighbourhood scale, interdependent communities with more local patterns to daily life. These are all applicable to Australia, but there's a few other specific issues we want to look at. So we'll mention the Aboriginal politics. So this is one area where the pre-existing sovereignty of Aboriginal people, the ability to make and administer law, has been radically undermined by colonisation and dispossession of the Aboriginal people, and this has not been appropriately settled in terms of the constitutional legal framework. So we need to look toward a treaty. And with that, we need to look to constitutional reform. But there's a few areas we need to look to constitutional reform, and we're some way away from that. So with future constitutional reform, we've got a constitutional republic. We can look to that. We can look to other issues like Australia as part of a broader political union. We can rewrite the whole constitution at some stage. But there's a few issues that we're looking at. The republic, there is a treaty with Aboriginal Australia and the broader Australia. As part of that, we want to enable a pan-Australian Aboriginal governance to support local capacity through those Aboriginal communities, and also with a common political union amongst Aboriginal people. with which then the broader Australia is able to liaise and engage with politically. And the third thing we're looking at today in terms of that constitutional reform is the redrawing of state boundaries, where I talked about the city-state as a natural major administrative centre. So that city-state scale is something like North Queensland, it's something like Brisbane region, Brisbane and East, and there's Western Brisbane and West, there's the Gold Coast and Northern Rivers perhaps, Central Queensland, that kind of scale, Tasmania, that kind of scale enables us to build these local civilizations that I was talking about, that to build this administrative capacity for where people can build strong local identity and a local civilization where our lives and the lives of our descendants can be tied and build a common culture within those local civilizations. And again, we look at that mosaic, that idea of a mosaic of local civilizations amidst the great peace of a global society. So those are the topics I wanted to cover here today. The polarity, the principles of governance derived from this concept, this cosmological concept of polarity and balance, how we can describe and framework for an ideal society with using those principles, with direction for specific policy reform, major reform, and step-by-step, careful and methodical, yet major reform, moving toward in the direction of those ideals. A great work for all of us together, not something that can be done by some elite. People need to build it together and for ourselves. That's it. Have a good day.